Greetings, my name is Liam Leston, and today I will be giving my theory to who the killer is in Danganronpa F Shattered Hope Chapter 1. Now, let me start by addressing whether or not it's worth doing a theory about the killer at this point. With the announcement of the series getting a revamp, it is now unclear how much of the murder plot is going to change. I think that there's a fair argument that a video like this is a bit of a waste of time. However, for me, this is something that's a bit more personal. I've watched this series closely and have done a few videos theorizing about its mysteries. I have a lot of energy invested in this, and perhaps others would feel the same too. So in order to get some sense of closure, I feel it's important to put out one more video where I will finally accuse someone of murder. Be I right or wrong, this is my final answer. So now I can sit back and patiently await the revamp's answer, whatever it may be. Hopefully, you guys find some value in this as well. I personally think it's one of my best theories so far. As well, I want to give a special shout out to the Shattered Hope team. It has been a long road so far, and I appreciate the continued work on the project, and I will continue to be here as a fan in eager anticipation for the continuation of the series. Let's start with why Rox went to room 1B. There are two broad causes. One, she went voluntarily, and two, she was taken by force. Given that there's no physical evidence of an assault outside of room 1B, I think it would be safe to assume she went there voluntarily. However, there doesn't seem to be any known motive for why Rox would go there in the middle of the night. If we don't know about it, then I think it's reasonable to assume that she went there because of some sort of secret interaction with one of the other participants. The person most likely to lure her to room 1B is the killer, so I assume that Rox was given some sort of note with instructions to go to room 1B. I think this is reasonable because mysterious notes are sort of common in murder mysteries, and they don't really have to be discovered right away. Sometimes they're sort of like a revelation that shows up later on in the story. Now, following the instructions of a mysterious note telling you to leave your room in the middle of the night while a motive is in play seems like a bad idea. However, Rox is a character that is known for making rash decisions that gets her into shitty situations, such as attacking Monokuma or staying behind to examine the dead bodies alone. So I think depending on what is written in the note, Rox could be enticed to leave her room. However, I think Rox would take some sort of precaution. So she goes to the kitchen and grabs the knife before going to room 1B. I think this makes sense if you compare it to the murder case from Danganronpa Trigger Happy Havoc. In that case, a knife is taken from the kitchen by a blue-haired girl who ends up murdered with a broken wrist. In this case, we have a blue-haired girl who ends up murdered with a bruised forearm. The similarities are strong enough that I think it's reasonable to assume that Rox, like Sayaka, took a knife from the kitchen. When Rox arrives in room 1B, I think she finds the room empty. So she goes to the window and gazes out until the person she is supposed to meet arrives. However, she is not alone. The killer is hiding in the room. They grab a stool, sneak up behind Rox, and knock her out. At this point, the killer is unaware that Rox has a knife hidden on her person. This scenario explains why Rox's hat, along with one of the stools, is found on the left side of the room next to the window. As well, this is likely the source of trauma to the back of Rox's head. In order to explain the rest of the murder plot, we need to understand the tools at the killer's disposal. The tools used by the killer were items left behind by Yaxi during one of her exercises. Yaxi tells us When she exercised with Twin, they had found a long rope hidden in the back of the storage room. She was bummed because it was too long to use. I think that Yaxi eventually did find a way to use the rope. She used it in a similar way to how Rox was killed. The long rope was used to create some sort of crude pull-down exercise machine. Here is how I think it might have looked. Instead of tying the rope onto the TV mount, the rope was tied to several weights. And then on the other side, the rope was tied into a loop with one of the smaller ropes fed through to create a sort of handle. Then, the ends of the short rope were curled back and held into place with athletic tape. This was used to create a firm grip to hold onto. She would then exercise by pulling down on the rope to lift the weights on the other side of the monitor. However, things did not go according to plan. The weights were too heavy and the rope began to fray. This is the first damage found on the rope just above Rox's head. This is why Yaxi said she was surprised that it held Rox's weight, because to her, it frayed rather easily, but like she said, she tends to underestimate her own strength. Afterwards, similar to how she left her stuff in room 1A, she also left everything behind in room 1B. This setup would eventually be found by the killer, becoming the inspiration for hanging Rox. Now, some of you might note that there were no exercise weights found at the crime scene. I will explain what happened to them later on. With that in mind, let's return to the murder. To hang Rox, the killer took advantage of the setup left behind by Yaxi. In order to get the leverage needed to hang Rox, rather than placing Rox on the podium, they planned to use the weights left by Yaxi. They placed the weights, one at a time, on the podium and then placed Rox on the ground with the noose around her neck. Once everything was set up, they would just have to push over the podium and the weights would fall and then pull Rox up to her final position. We are also able to determine that the exercise weights are heavier than Rox. We know that Rox does not cause the rope to fray, but the weights do. Therefore, the exercise weights are heavier than Rox and could be used for the hanging. However, there was a problem. We know that there are friction burns on Rox's wrists. This is likely the result of Rox struggling to escape, therefore Rox must have regained consciousness at some point. Assuming she was able to get her hands free, the killer would try to intervene and stop her escape. To defend herself, Rox would take out the knife that she had hidden on her person and take a swipe at the killer. I think the killer quickly jumped back to avoid the knife. In their haste, they knocked over the table. Now that Rox has a little bit of room, she tries to quickly cut the noose around her neck. Unfortunately, the rope is behind her head so she cannot see it. As well, she is panicking. Therefore, all of her cuts are at random angles in positions that ultimately fail to cut through the rope. This is the second damage found on the rope a little bit lower down. To stop Rox, the killer rolls over, leans over the table, and grabs a stool. However, something important happens here. I think when the killer dodges backwards to avoid the knife, they are not 100% successful. I think the killer is grazed on their right thigh. Given that Rox is seated on the floor, it would make sense that the knife would make contact somewhere on the lower half of the body. If this is true, then when the killer leans over the table, that part of the body would press into the table, leaving blood behind. This is the first blood stain. The killer then uses the stool to bash the knife out of Rox's hand. This causes the bruising on only Rox's left forearm, This also explains why the second stool is found out of place. As well, it explains the signs of the struggle found in the room. With Rox now disarmed, the killer still has to restrain Rox. Naturally, Rox continues to resist. During the struggle, they bump into the podium, and as we learned, the podium is light and easily knocked over. So it is knocked over along with the weights, causing Rox to be hung. This leads to Rox's death. After this, I think the killer did little else in the room. I think they simply took the knife and left to treat their injuries. We will cover this in more detail later. For now, I want to talk about who found the body afterwards and how they all altered the crime scene. I think the first person to find Rox was Cancel. This has to do with the crystal shards found near the door. Korza mentions that he had not seen anything like it in the academy, and Enigma wonders if either the killer or Rox had something that no one else had. We know each of the characters has a unique item that no one else has. For example, Enigma has candy, Rox has her journal. It is reasonable that Cancel may have had some sort of scrying mirror. In theory, she may have seen something in it that led her to room 1B. When she enters, she sees Rox is hung, she panics, drops the mirror causing it to shatter, and then runs out of the room, leaving the door wide open, and then returns to her room. However, I don't think Cancel will count as the first witness. I think it is entirely possible that thanks to the powers of the scrying mirror, that she was able to find Rox while she was still alive. This is important because in this scenario, Cancel would have seen the crime scene exactly as the killer left it, before any of the additional changes were made by the others who found the body. Given this is true, it could explain Cancel's behavior during the investigation. When she is asked to use her talent to find the killer, she says, "No, I can't." She can't use her talent because she broke the scrying mirror, but doesn't want to explain the circumstances under which it broke. She may be ashamed to admit that she failed to help Rox and left her hanging in room 1B. I think the next person to find Rox was Yaxi. We know from her heart rate monitor, Yaxi finished her exercise in room 1A at 3 a.m. As she is returning to the dorms, she notices that the door to room 1B was left open and then becomes the first person to witness Rox dead. Yaxi notices the killer made use of the items she left behind and worries that if the others find this, they will naturally question her and likely even suspect her of murder. So, Yaxi alters the crime scene. However, she has two conflicting goals here. She wants to hide her involvement while still allowing the others to solve the crime. So, she creates a similar scenario. First, she removes the exercise weights. Instead, she plans to tie the rope to the mount instead. Given that Yaxi was the one to originally set up the space for exercise, she may have learned that the monitor moves slightly at that time. In order to reach the mount, she would have to move the podium. If it was meant to hold the exercise weights, it would have been placed just under the monitor. So, after it was knocked over, it would lie on the ground blocking access to the mount. I think when Yaxi moved it, she moved it next to the table with the blood on it. They make contact, causing blood to end up on the base of the podium. When Yaxi is done, she can't return it to its original spot because it no longer makes sense for it to be directly onto the monitor now. So she eventually moves it to its final location, creating the impression that Rox was placed on the podium. When it comes to tying the rope to the mount, Yaxi would not need leverage to do this. Given that Yaxi was able to exercise with the weights that are heavier than rocks, she may have been able to lift and tie the rope to the mount with just her raw strength. This allows Yaxi to remove the exercise weights from the room and hide the fact that she was exercising in that room at all. The short ropes and athletic tape is easily accessible to anyone, so all she would have to do is mention that Twin also knew about the long rope, and she therefore gains plausible deniability. Other than this, I think Yaxi left everything else as it was, including leaving the door open. I think the next person to find rocks was Cross. After the incident during the welcoming party, Cross has spent the whole day locked in his room. I would assume that he was getting rather hungry. In order to avoid others, he left his room early in the morning and went to the kitchen. On the way there, he sees the room to 1B left open and sees Rox dead. He then becomes the second witness. In response, he sets a trap. He closes the door and then hides behind the red door and waited to see how the others respond. To his surprise, he sees Rock enter the room for seemingly no reason. This is why he immediately enters the room after Rock and begins to accuse him of things. Rock said that the body discovery announcement went off before Cross entered the room. This makes sense because Yaxi and Cross had already discovered the body, and cancel doesn't count because Rox was still alive at the time. Thus, Rock became the third person and set off the body discovery announcement. Alright, now let's talk about who the killer is. In this video, I'm going to accuse Rissy. Let's go over the reasons. First off, Rissy can be stealthy. We know this is true because Rissy sneaks up behind Enigma and covers his eyes before they go to the welcoming party. This is useful for the killer because they initially knock out Rox by sneaking up behind her and hitting her in the head with a stool. Second off, Rissy is too weak to break Rox's wrists. In Trigger Happy Havoc, the killer Leon breaks Sayaka's wrist using a fake sword. Given Leon is the ultimate baseball star, it would make sense that his swing would have enough strength to break someone's wrists. Therefore, if the killer was as skilled as Pocket or as strong as Grisp or Yaxi, then we would expect Rox's wrists to be broken as well. Instead, the forearm is bruised, suggesting the killer is notably weaker and/or less skilled. Also note that there seems to be multiple bruises on the forearms, suggesting multiple hits. I think this makes sense if it was Rissy trying to disarm someone. Thirdly, Rissy would need the exercise weights to commit the murder. Enigma notes to himself that someone would need to be strong enough to lift Rox onto the podium. This would normally exclude Rissy. With the weights, Rissy could do it because she wouldn't need to lift all the weights at once. She would only have to lift a fraction of the weight at one time. This would ultimately create a scenario where Rissy would be physically capable of committing the murder. Normally, these details would not matter a whole lot because Rissy has a very strong alibi via Twin. But let me give you an alternative explanation of what Twin saw that night. After Rissy receives a cut to her right thigh, she returns to her room to treat it. In Trigger Happy Havoc, the female students are given a sewing kit. Something similar may be true in the case of Rissy. In the free time events, Rissy mentions that she likes to do arts and crafts and wants to make something for Enigma. As well, prior to heading to the welcoming party, Rissy mentions dropping something off in her room. It is possible that the crafting that she was planning may have involved needle and thread. Given this, Alongside Rissy's medical knowledge as a dentist, she would be able to stitch up the injury to her leg. Furthermore, we learn on the morning of day 2 that Enigma was given 6 copies of identical clothing. This means after Rissy cleaned herself up, she would be able to put on a clean pair of identical pants. Furthermore, I think Rissy may have actually gone a step further. In Trigger Happy Havoc, Leon attempts to destroy his bloodstained shirt in the incinerator. I think Rissy may have had the same plan. She left her room to destroy the bloodstained pants in the incinerator. Twin testifies that he saw Rissy leaving the dorms. That means Rissy would be facing away from Twin, and Twin therefore would be unable to see if she was holding a pair of pants. Also note that the female bathroom is right next to the incinerator room. Rissy testifies that when she left the bathroom, she saw Twin waiting down the hallway. If Twin was far away, it would be reasonable that he may have been mistaken as to which room Rissy had used. Rissy claimed that she went to the pool to help her anxiety. Seeing as she was spotted shortly after murder, Twin would definitely be able to testify that Rissy seemed rather anxious. Furthermore, they claim that they arrived at the pool at 1:40 a.m., 5 minutes before the estimated time of death. I don't think Twin is a reliable witness in regards to time. When Rule announces the welcoming party, Twin says that he is bad with clocks and stuff. In fact, he is almost late to the welcoming party. This suggests to me that we should not take Twin's account of the time particularly seriously. There is a very real likelihood that he may only be repeating back to us what Rissy had told him about the time. The timing of events may be notably different than what they claimed. In Trigger Happy Havoc, Sayaka dies at 1:30 a.m. This means we could reasonably assume that Rox was initially hung at 1:30 a.m. However, Rox would not have died instantly. The exact moment she would have died would be unclear. This is why Rule estimated her time of death to be 1:45 a.m. Given this scenario where Cancel arrives late enough to avoid seeing the killer, but soon enough to still find Rox alive, it is possible that she left her room around 1:40 a.m. This would mean that Rissy would have about 10 minutes to finish the murder and return to her room without being seen by Cancel. If Cancel did leave at 1:40 a.m., this would then conflict with the testimony from Twin and Rissy. Even if they didn't see Cancel, they likely would have heard her. When Cancel enters room 1B and sees Rox, she likely would have screamed before she fled the room. So even if Rissy and Twin were in the pool, they should have still at least heard her that night. Unless they were still in their rooms at the time. The dorm rooms appear to be soundproofed. After the 2 dead girls were discovered on the other side of the red door, Cancel was able to hear Pocket scream from the lounge area. When Scarlet left her room, Cancel needed to inform her about the scream, and therefore no one would have heard Cancel's screams. Therefore, Rissy and Twin had most likely left the rooms at the earliest of 1:45 a.m., and therefore they would arrive at the pool after the estimated time of death. This would mean that Rissy would have both the time to commit the murder and the time to treat her injuries afterwards. With that, I have established methodology that would give Rissy both the capability and opportunity to commit the murder. That is the end of my theory. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you think in the comment section and have yourself a wonderful day.